panel this morning, I think that we're going to get booted out of here at a particular time. So I think we do need to stay on schedule, and we're already running a bit behind schedule. So if I could just ask the presenters, if at all possible, to try to shave a minute or two off of your talks, if you're able to, just so that we don't get stuck at the very end without the ability to have any discussion or be cut off. I think that what I would like to do is invite the individual presenters to present. We're going to have 4 presentations followed by hopefully 15 minutes of Q&A. So for this invited talk to Design Justice, we're going to have Jan Krimsky, the design director and principal at Perkins and Will, and then Tina, could you help me with pronounce your last name, please?
Don't worry, it's Giorgadze.
Giorgadze. All right, got it. Senior interior designer, Perkins and Will. Just want to make sure I get it right. My last name Bonoy is not so easy to pronounce, so I understand if you're not familiar. But are you two ready to present?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Why don't we go ahead and start right away and launch into this launch into your discussion.
Sure. All right. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Jan Krimsky, and I am the design director for our Los Angeles studio of Perkins and Will. So we're really happy to be here. I'm here with Tina.
Hi, my name is Tina Giorgadze. I'm senior interior designer at Perkins and Will. And yet, I think you have to switch the screen. You have a presenter screen shared right now.
Oh, okay. Thanks for telling me that. Okay, we'll leave that mode. Okay, so we wanted to talk to you today about basically a product that we're developing in our studio that we call Dome. And this is a kind of a sleep pod, really a piece of furniture, and it's specifically developed for interim housing. We wanted to tell you the story about how we came to want to develop a product like this, and how we've gone about doing it, what we've learned along the way, just kind of talk about the journey and then tell you where we're at now. So the story begins back in 2018. We received a letter for qualifications for a project with the Bureau of Engineers. And this image I wanted to share with all of you because it really startled me. When I was looking at it, I couldn't figure out what it was at first. And then I realized that those are beds. And I thought, wow, this must be where we're at in terms of our housing crisis. And this is really kind of an illustration of how severe the problem is. And I started to use my designer brain and start to think about ways of trying to make something that was pretty oppressive seeming better. Can we bring in natural light? Can we add privacy? All of those kind of things. And that was the beginning of this journey. So that led to our role in developing 5 of the Bridge Home sites throughout Los Angeles. So Bridge Home is our city's program for housing, interim housing for people coming in and transitioning into permanent supportive housing. So as we started that project, we did a bit of research like we always do, actually quite a bit of research here in terms of how interim housing works, how it operates, and who really stays and how long. Because at that time, I remember I didn't even really differentiate between interim housing and shelters. So the first thing that's really startling is of the 66,500 or so people that are in our current homeless count in Los Angeles County, 18,395 of them stay in interim housing or some type of shelter. So they're living in this kind of environment. So the first thing we did was actually start to visit interim housing facilities and talk to different operators. We wanted to understand how they worked, what their challenges were. We wanted to talk to people who were staying at them and talk about their experiences, because we wanted to approach this both from the pragmatic standpoint, but also we wanted to think about this in terms of individual experience. And so here's a snapshot of some of the things we see. And the first thing that you can see is there isn't an established way of doing things, right? Every operator has their own set of furniture, their own partition system. Everything is kind of piecemeal. It's put together really piecemeal. And so it was from us coming from, we work on a lot of healthcare in our office. We work on a lot of office space, workplace design. We have companies like Herman Miller constantly pitching us for the latest and greatest in ergonomic design or healthcare best practices. And it just seemed like here's a space where there's this total absence of industry really developing product for something that really needs it. And so we thought immediately, can we bring in a partner and start to look at this in the same way that we do look at our workplace design and healthcare design? So we started off some conversations with them. I do want to say the other thing that we got out of this that I want to share before I move on is that while these facilities were initially thought of as a 1 month stay or 2 month stay, the reality is that people stay in these facilities now for 6 months to a year, and even sometimes longer than that, sometimes 2 years. And that's because of the shortage of housing. And so we're not talking about an overnight shelter or stay somewhere, for a week. We're actually talking about people living in these facilities for extended periods of time. So before I get into sort of developing how we develop the products and reached out to manufacturers, I do want to tell you a little bit about the Bridge Home program and what that looks like. So these are temporary, they're 3 years or more, solutions for people to transition into permanent supportive housing. As I mentioned, it's a citywide program, and really it's a really unglamorous kind of thing to do as an architect. You're really just putting together a kit of parts on a site. What we're doing is really saying, if we've got a site with a tree growing on it, that we're going to use that as a opportunity for people to have a dining canopy or some common space. So we're taking every possible asset that these sites come with and turning them into a better quality space. And that's kind of what we're working with. But when you get into the actual membrane structure, the kind of big tent that they use, the furniture systems that they're using, there really wasn't a product out there for us to say, that system looks really good. It was something that we had to sort of describe and really we wrote a spec for it. And this was what came out of that. Which is, as you can see, it comes with many of the same problems that you see in interim housing facilities. There isn't a lot of privacy, a lot of personal space, and you do have people staying in these shelters for a long time. So we thought, we didn't immediately think that this is going to be something that we develop in-house and try to grow it from there. We thought we would reach out to Steelcase, Herman Miller, and all the folks that we knew that are good at this and can produce at volume, because the point here was not to do research. The point here was to improve the situation and see how we can make change happen quickly. And so we started conversations with Steelcase around creating a system of furniture that interim housing providers could use in their facilities. And what came out of that is really, as we started to pare things down, we started with this kind of like Swiss Army knife. It had everything. And then we got to a point where we realized, well, how do we navigate between something that has all of these bells and whistles and something that really deals with the main thing, which is this challenge of privacy. And so we thought, we like to describe our projects in the form of IKEA instructions. So we kind of hijack an IKEA instruction kit and we create a diagram about what the project is. And in this case, this is the one we produced. We have the real problem here is the real lack of privacy and dignity in these facilities. And how do we create a system that's really simple and that offers a lot of flexibility to operators so that it can be implemented? And so the idea that we came up with was a kind of hybrid pod. So the way that it works is you actually build drywall partitions, but you build just a low, simple partition. This is something that we saw happening in a lot of existing facilities, because drywall partitions are simple and common and easy to build and really quick to erect. Anyone that does office TI knows that that's the easiest thing to do. And if we could start with that kind of spine with electrical in it, then we have something to anchor a piece of furniture to. Then we can create a kind of more private sleeping pod very easily, but just by sliding a unit up against the wall. And that's really where the idea emerged. So I'm going to pass it over to Tina, and she's going to take us through the rest of the development of the project.
Thank you, Jan. So as we described, the unit itself is like 6 by 7 foot unit with a 6 foot height. And the shape of the storage unit that you see is very intentional, because that curve kind of allows this easy movement for the optional fabric canopy that we're also offering. The materiality was very important for us to consider, and we decided to go with a solid polymer Corian type of product that was easily maintainable, easily cleanable over time. And then inside the storage units, we were starting to use wood elements to bring a little bit more warmth. The unit itself also has a night light, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, and also has USB charger. But I wanted to go and describe really how far we went. So obviously with one unit, you can assemble the space however you want, but we had our own ideas and our own suggestions how facility would organize the space in between. So we were focusing on suggesting to create cluster of 4 or 6 pods at a time that could form those sub-communities itself. So facility, for example, will provide this low pony wall, and from here we would grow those clusters, and then in the space you have those like a sub zones in between the bigger space. Obviously we were very intentional about the aisle sizes, so we're offering, or we're suggesting, to go with a main circulation aisle to be wider, but then in between we're going with more like a 44-inch space that allows, it's not too wide, and it kind of creates this kind of privacy within the unit or within the cohort of 4 or 6 units. And those kind of units could be used for families, for couples, or for like a group of friends. It just creates this sense of community, and it creates opportunities to have more like a social spaces within as well. So this was really our approach, how you would organize the space. We were also thinking really deep about the lighting, because usually they have to provide overhead lighting for emergency reasons and security. And it's really uncomfortable at nighttime to have this overhead light. So we decided to incorporate this lighting element within the unit and position it low enough so it doesn't really shine in your eyes. We studied like what would be the level, and we came up with a fixture and the positioning that would allow good distribution at nighttime without and eliminating the need for overhead lighting. And that kind of works really well in these kind of situations. We also at Perkinson will have this internal innovation incubator research grant. And we applied for the grant, and this grant allowed us to actually dive into design even further. We built full-size cardboard model. And with that, we were able to really examine every single detail of the unit, where the USB charger is located, where is lighting, what is the size of the doors, fabric canopies. It just allowed us to really get prepared to create actual prototype. Now for the real prototype with the real product, we needed good partner, and we partnered with Shield Manufacturing. They're casework manufacturers out of Kansas City, but they've done large projects, and they were adventurous enough really to go along with us on creating this unit. So finally, we had an opportunity to build and see the real product. And at that time, we used this opportunity to actually organize the exhibition with A&D Museum. And this exhibition was really focused on spreading awareness about homelessness crisis, spreading awareness about the interim housing, and really allowed us to showcase our attempt to really address homelessness within Los Angeles. This way, we had a very good, social media coverage. We had a lot of publicity, a lot of inquiries really started to come in. We started to talk with LA County Department of Health, with a lot of other operators. And from there, we started to really examine real projects. So we had some inquiries. For example, here you see the test pit for bridge housing. And while we went through with this organizing those spaces, we discovered that we're actually optimizing space with this unit. We're really using all the available space. And as you can see here with the current, their original layout, which would have been 42 beds, we were increasing it to 46. And that proved to be true in every facility that we worked. So right now we have 2 projects on board. Those are real projects, and they're both in Los Angeles, one in downtown, another in South LA. And we're anticipating to have like 100 units purchased from each project. We are hoping to see these completed somewhere in mid-summer. So, but we're actually continuing development of the unit. Currently, we're creating fabric canopy 2.0. Basically, we're testing all the elements and all the details of it, and it has to be compliant, code compliant for there in the space.
Yeah, it's really about, you know, we work on a number of efforts that have to do with houselessness across Los Angeles. And one of the things that we find in common on all of them is that the conversation tends to be about numbers and about speed. And when we talk about personal experience, it's usually not on those jobs. It's on our more the work that we do for a higher end clientele. And what we want to do is we want to bring the experience conversation to all of our work, and really look at this from the vantage point of what is this experience like for people, and how can we use design to make it better and send them a message that they matter. So thank you very much for your attention and for the opportunity to present Dome. And we'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. What we're going to do here is we're going to save the kind of Q&A until the end. So if we could, what would be helpful is if anyone in the audience could use the chat to write questions down, anything that you'd like to talk about, please use the chat for that. And thank you both of you. There was I saw the exhibition, it was wonderful. I would like to invite our next presenters up, if I may. My colleague, Luciana Barculja, who is a lecturer at USC School of Architecture, and Valerie Toronto, who is a student. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so go ahead.
Can you see my screen?
I can see a black screen, but not an image.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to not do the full screen. Right. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Let me see if I can you see my screen now? Let's see if I
Yes.
can. Right. So we're going to be Valerie and I, we're going to be presenting the Expanding the Housing Typology Toolkit, which is a research that we've been working as a team with Casey Hughes, Jose Herasti, and I, and the students Alex Mulanix, Lindsay Lentz, and Valerie Taranto. And Alex and Lindsay worked with us before. Now we have still Valerie on board. I'm thankful for having Valerie here with us. So I'm going to try to go quickly to our presentation. So our initiative was established from the 2019 AIA LA Design for Dignity Conference. Many working group sections came out from that conference, and our goal was to establish an innovative housing typology subcommittee. So the idea was to create a roadmap that could clear and lead to a series of opportunities. That roadmap would include building typologies, where we would be highlighting costs, limitations, project scale. We will also be talking about land, size ownership and zoning, innovative acquisition options such as profit sharing with owners and other options. We would also include talking about money, so source of capital for development projects, public, private, and possibly other options. And we also would be identifying users that could address their needs through this research. So Jose Case and I, we started working with the AILA and USC with the help of the USC students, Lindsay, Valerie, and Alex. One thing that I want to highlight here, we are all volunteers and working on this effort. We don't have a grant. We are just pretty much trying as much as we can put our time and our effort into this work. So we start to questioning we start to have many discussions about this topic, right? Who will be putting this for? What is the objective? How it should be structured? So Fernanda Bento, who is Jose's business partner, introduced us to Brenda Vivo. She's the USC Initiative to Eliminate Homelessness Director. And we get to know her work with the Housing Typology Toolkit documents. So the Housing Typology Toolkit highlights innovation in how people are housed. It also documents about lender ownership, financial models, incentives, policies, and typologies based on building types, and provides sources for additional information. So from that point on, we start to think about what would be the expansion to that toolkit, already the existing document created by Brenda and her team. So we came up with this idea of expanding that toolkit, right? So it intends to build up on the USC's initiative, but and also would map and quantify the current uses in LA, explaining zoning constraints and zoning overlays in residential zones, and classifies types of buildings, showcasing case studies in the city. So both the Housing Typology Toolkit and the Housing Typology Toolkit expansion aim to increase the housing production by providing relevant and useful information to the general public about the zoning context and innovation in housing. The goal of this initiative is to provide a clear visual overview of zoning in LA, and we want also this to be an accessible tool for anyone who is interested in the subject or is looking for more information on how to expand the housing options in LA. So here, quickly, we ended up identifying three research arms to go through this project. The research arm one, we would be identifying, we call the mapping. So mapping would be the quantitative analysis of LA city zoning to statistically quantify the existing condition and to sample portions of the city to highlight opportunities. We use these maps to overlay other information. We also identify research arm 2 as zoning primer and research arm 3 as the models of innovation. So the zoning, the first one, that's mapping. So we start to identify different LA zones and overlay that information. And also what we call the sampling with all those overlays. We also are looking to the Mapping Inequality Project. And also we have an ambition of trying to bring some of the redlining from LA into our mapping. We also we are looking to many documents. So I think it's important to highlight that this idea of documenting housing, right? We acknowledge that there are many documents, there are many groups and organizations working on that effort, and we've been in contact with some of them. We had many conversations. We are also exposing the work out there through this symposium, also to potentially find new partners in terms of exchange of information. But so we are looking at it. There's a lot of existing information already out there. So this is the housing element from the cities also highlighted. We have some maps that allow us to highlight zoning opportunities, which is something that we also want to look into this through our project. So we are identifying existing documents that can help us with that effort. So research, the zoning primer, right? Our research arm 2, that one which visually describes key concepts in LA zoning policy and compares what is achievable with the residential zoning designations. This research will also aim to give a comprehensive view of the many local, state, and federal regulations that overlay basic zoning designations by giving an overview on how the large number of ordinances, plans, and policies fit together. And here we are trying to identify what would be the way to illustrate all that information, right? What would be the way to catalog all that information and all that zoning overlay from different kind of plans, specific plans, and all the other information. So I think this is just kind of more of a sample of how we would be diagramming and annotating and also illustrating the information of the research arm too. So research arm 3, we are looking to models of innovation. So here we are identifying areas of innovation and opportunity within the contemporary housing landscape. So here we start to think about how to catalog all that, right? There's a lot of information, how we would look into ways of identifying and cataloging that information. So we start looking to taxonomy from biology and try to understand what are ways that we could bring that way of organizing through a taxonomy, different type of, right, what the work that we've been doing in terms of the innovation, the models of innovation. So we identify the intervention type, construction strategy, spatial approach, design strategy, sustainability, sponsors, incentives, profile from the residents or living models, and then the project title of and archetype. Here, what we are trying to do is a way to come up from a larger umbrella to a smaller one. And not having the title, the project title and the archetype would be an important information, but we didn't want that to become the main information in how to categorize all that, all those types, all those typologies. So quickly looking to financial information, we are looking to the Housing Typology Toolkit as a reference. The Housing Typology Toolkit highlights cost and financial models. So we are definitely, that can support the typologies highlighted in this study. We are also still looking at that as a reference to bring up to our projects. We are also interested in talking about material and labor. So we wanted to take a closer look at the materials and labor conditions that we are building with. So how that's being applied to shelter. We know that there's a lot of conversations that happen in the fashion industry and then in the food industry. And now we are bringing to the construction industry in terms of questioning where materials are extracted from, and also labor conditions involved into the process. So, and all the supply chain. So we want to somehow bring some of that also into this research. And then with all that, we realized that would be good to try to document this in phases. So we have this effort, we are trying to put a document would be kind of a phase 1. So we are setting up the framework of the phase 1, and we are choosing prefab. And then the question is why prefab will be our first document that we would put out there from this research. We're trying to break down into different documents, and the first one will be prefab. So the state law is easing restriction on access for dwelling units, right? In many other type of housing typologies in LA City, that's happening pretty fast. So we see that prefab is becoming one of the adopted options that might be more and more common. So we saw many of the current typologies that we've been working with that could fall into the category like ADUs, infill, micro units, bridge homes, modular construction. And Valerie will talk a little bit more about that, also including some of the pros and cons from that type of construction. So Valerie, do you want to take it over?
Yeah, sounds good. So here you can see a few different examples of the classifications for 3 different prefab and modular projects of the research. So bridge home, affordable housing complex, and then a permanent supportive housing building as well. So this shows the wide range of prefab and how it's been adapted. You can go to the next slide. And then here are 6 examples of the various scales that prefab has been used in Los Angeles, from bridge homes to being a kit of parts, ADU, modular apartments, and then the fabricated units for bridge homes that Perkins and Will just spoke about. And these projects show that the scales of prefab vary in the amount of the components as well as the amount of the housing that the structures provide. So we've discovered that the main benefits of prefab and modular is the ability to minimize cost and schedule of construction by over 50% on average. And this reduction is due to a redistribution of labor of the type and quantity of labor. There's often less waste during the process as factories are able to reuse material waste from previous projects. And because the modules are assembled in a factory, the construction process is a lot less labor intensive as factory workers are shielded from the environment, and the labor rates tend to be lower than most field rates. So part of the cons is that prefab is not yet widely known as something that can create appealing housing, which can be prohibitive in the implementing of the into the design process. And most importantly, for prefab to be a feasible option, it's necessary for there to be appropriate access to the site so that the cranes can enter. So these are a few different methods in which prefab has been used that have been mentioned. The accessory dwelling units, micro units or tiny homes, adapted to bridge homes, adaptive reuse, scalable to infill with the Nest Toolkit, and then 3D printing as well.
So here in terms of sustainability, like Valerie mentioned, definitely the idea of reduction of waste is something that we are looking to prefab as something that we want to definitely research it further. So there studies show that prefabrication can reduce till 90% of the waste that happens in construction sites. So there are some topics that we want to approach with the sustainability is still connecting with the idea of materials and labor that we previously mentioned.
And this spreadsheet is showing how the projects have been collected and classified, going back to the earlier taxonomy classification. And this was helping us to understand the various components of each project.
Yeah, and the conclusions here, we are aiming to create this document with a prefab framework by the summer. We want to wrap up this by the summer, and we definitely want to, with this research, set up other frameworks for upcoming documents. And again, like we mentioned, the idea of exposing here with the symposium is also trying to bridge new connections or find ways that we can potentially find a grant or connect with sponsorship in order to put this document out there. We don't have, if that's going to be more of a, not a printed, but maybe a digital formats, we are still figuring out what is going to be the format, but we are definitely, we want the project to have more exposure through the symposium. So, and Brenda was supposed to be here, but she had a personal issue, but she's looking forward. She's a mentor, and we really appreciate Brenda's involvement in mentoring us for this project. And we are looking for more of discussions like that. And thank you again for your time.
Great. Well, Luciana and Valerie, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And thank you also for helping us to stay on track here, even though we're late, obviously, with the entire afternoon. Okay, with that, I would like to introduce my colleague, Ginger Nolan, who will be our next presenter. Ginger, I think you should be able to share screen. Can see that. Great. Thank you very much, Ginger.
Do you see presenter view, or you see just the slide?
Now I see the actual slideshow view with no
Okay,
presenter slides. So ready to go.
Okay, thanks so much for the introduction, Jeff. So today I'm going to be presenting a project funded by the School of Architecture. Because of some delays related to the pandemic, I'm only just beginning to embark on the fieldwork component of the research. So what I'll present today are some preliminary hypotheses, questions, and goals. The project begins with a proposition that many parts of the world are currently experiencing a shift from post-Fordism to something else, something I'm ingeniously calling post-Fordism. So post-Fordism is characterized by the increasing expansion of automation that has replaced and will be replacing many jobs. especially in service industries, manufacturing, and agricultural production and food processing. Leading me to ask, what happens to the city, suburbs, and countryside when the 9-to-5 workday and workplace commute cease to be predominant forces structuring spatial relations? What do people do with themselves when they don't have fixed employment? Might they have new spatial, infrastructural, and architectural requirements? So as we know, over the past century or 2 centuries, cities have transformed in tandem with changing economic paradigms. In the early decades of North American industrialization, we find highly centralized cities with workers typically living very close to their sites of employment, whereas now we find suburban decentralization coupled with urban gentrification and the growth of low skill and low wage jobs in often very high rent areas. And as we know, this means that many people with low wage jobs, as we just saw, can't afford to live anywhere, even remotely near their places of work, or sometimes can't afford to live anywhere, period. So some parts of the US, of course, have responded by increasing, sometimes doubling the minimum wage. However, these wages, no matter how much they're increased, the minimum wage is often still inadequate relative to costs of living, such as in cities like Los Angeles. Furthermore, higher wages give employers even more economic incentive. They don't necessarily need that economic incentive, but it gives them further incentive to automate jobs and replace human workers. I'm not saying we shouldn't raise wages therefore, but this is just to point out what's happening. So this is happening in service industries with automated checkout systems. It's expected to soon affect many manufacturing industries, with garment industries being a very likely target, as well as agriculture, and especially urban and suburban agriculture because of the much higher costs of land and wages in those areas. So this is just to say that many sectors of work currently performed by low-income earners are at risk of disappearing, raising the question, what worth do humans have to the state once their labor power no longer possesses market value? So what is a working class without work? If we think about sort of the politics right around the working class. And also bearing in mind, historic 20th century relationships between civil rights movements and labor movements, not only organized through labor, but also through the fact of groups collectively possessing a certain value of essential labor power. On the other hand, as secure forms of work disappear, casual employment is increasingly organized by digital media, with corporations often extracting high percentages of workers' earnings, withholding benefits, and providing no guaranteed level of income. Whereas workers, on the other hand, workers who lack access to those platforms are left with reduced opportunities for procuring employment. So this research seeks to better understand how urbanism can help address conditions of precarious employment, as well as sort of put pressure maybe on public policy. So I ask, first of all, what relationships exist between precarious forms of work and urban configurations? And one of the main starting points of this research is to conduct interviews with casual workers. First, these workers who use parking lots as hiring sites, and to ask some simple questions like, how far from work do you live? How do you get to work? How do you travel to and from job sites? How long do you wait for jobs? Where do you keep your tools and personal belongings? Do you share equipment and tools with colleagues? How do you balance the need for visibility against the need to be unobtrusive? Do you have access to toilets, running water? What do you do in extreme weather? And how do you negotiate wages, and how frequently are you cheated of wages that you've earned? So this is just a kind of sampling of questions that point to some of the hardships, of course, of casual employment, but moreover, they're intended to suggest certain relationships between those hardships and a lack of certain architectural infrastructures like shelter and toilets, but also certain perhaps nonprofit media infrastructures. And in this case, probably low-tech media because of the need to protect undocumented workers. So I'm thinking of media that can help connect employers to employees or help with language translation and wage negotiation and wage protections. At the same time, though, and this is the comparative part of this research, I'll be investigating relationships between urbanism and digital app facilitated forms of casual labor, asking some similar questions, as we see here. And part of the value of the research I'm proposing, I think, lies in, firstly, in comparing these very different forms of precarity. And just to give you an idea of what I plan to do with my research findings, one of the first steps will be data visualizations, using the help of architects and hopefully people with GIS skills. And in this sense, taking a cue from studies like these, which I sort of juxtapose with some degree of irony, given the Marxian leanings of the situationists and the actual conditions nowadays of compulsory itinerancy as a form of labor. So a kind of compulsory derive, right? So I show these images as models of the kinds of data visualizations that I might produce of, simply things, very simple things like routes taken by ride share and delivery drivers, just in order to start drawing connections between precarious work and urban organization. And the next step would be more speculative, asking, can we imagine new nonprofit urban infrastructures, services, and media platforms for organizing work and care while curbing excessive travel, for example? I mean, that's just one of the elements to address is travel. So the part of this research, right, is to use research visualization and design to propose possible improvements, but also more importantly, I think, to create awareness, right, around the relationships between urbanism and job precarity, awareness around the kind of growing threat posed by automation, and perhaps as a way of indirectly pressuring public policy. So I was going to then talk a little bit about the origin story of my interest in this topic, which began a couple of years ago with the rising public interest in universal basic income. And my response was just to think maybe in terms, and again, this is more kind of speculative than sort of a pragmatic real policy proposal, but to think in terms of urban basic income instead of universal individual focused basic income. But Jeff, like if we're running late on time, like I could stop here or I could spend a few more minutes, and it's not rude if you say stop here, like that's totally fine.
Well, I'm looking at our total time that we've been presenting, and theoretically we should be at 45 minutes when you're done, and we're at 39. So you have a few more, but overall we're way behind in terms of the overall schedule. So
I see. Okay. Well,
if anyone wants to volunteer a few minutes, that's great. But if you have some critical stuff you want to share, go ahead, and our Q&A will be cut off basically. So go ahead.
Okay, sure. So, some of the questions I pose in this, what is basically kind of a manifesto is, or some of the observations I make are that when a vast number of individuals become surplus to capital's needs, they risk losing political capital precisely at the moment when they most urgently need that political capital, right? That the idea that our labor power has traditionally been a collective form of political and cultural capital, right? That is disappearing for many people. So in my manifesto, I suggested that one way to combat a potential erosion of popular political power is to shift focus away from individuals' rights towards the rights of and to the city, that is, toward collective place-based forms of self-determination involving urban planning. And in the interest of establishing collective forms of self-determination, I propose that the urban, rather than the individual, serve as the recipient of basic income. So what I go on to do is propose that it's more of a thought experiment in some ways, right? Again, sort of thinking of sort of ways of sort of reimagining sort of the distribution of wealth and as a kind of component of urban planning. I go on to propose that the smallest political unit in any given municipality would receive urban basic income in proportion to the population. So in large cities, right, a city council district would be the smallest unit of governance, and in suburban and rural areas, it might be townships or counties that would receive this urban basic income. But the idea was that, the automation of many forms of labor and the low wages and precarity of many forms of labor, right? These are the driving motivations lying behind most proposals for universal basic income. but that it would actually in many ways make more sense that these issues be thought of also in relation to urbanism and urban planning rather than as only issues of income, although again, I don't discount the importance of income too. So, and just as a kind of numerical exercise, I looked at how Andrew Yang's universal basic income proposal that many of you probably might be familiar with, his proposal was that every adult every year would receive $1,000, not every adult, every non-incarcerated US legal, like a sort of legal US citizen, like passport holding citizen, whatever, every such citizen would receive $1,000 a month, so $12,000 per year. So I was thinking in terms of those quantities of money per person. I just looked at Los Angeles City Council District number 10 and deduced that this would translate for that particular city council district, it would translate to $2.2 billion a year in addition to whatever municipal expenditures the district already receives. So obviously I'm not saying, of course, I'm not a policymaker, I'm an architectural historian. And the point of this is not to elaborate actual policy proposals, but it's really to start to imagine the problem of unemployment and precarious employment being linked to urban issues and to think of addressing these issues partly through local interventions. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate that, Ginger. Thank you. And just moving ahead very, very quickly, just so we, again, save our Q&A if we have any time at the end. Like to invite our last presentation, pair of speakers, Faiza Motasim and Sasha Dels, talking about housing the workforce. I would like to just say a special thank you to Faiza for inviting me to moderate this this discussion. So if we do have time to have a discussion, I will look forward to moderating it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. And I was going to say thank you for agreeing to take on this role. So thank you so much for that. And thank you. Hello, and thank you everyone for being here. Today, Sasha and I will present our next research project called Housing the Workforce, Policies, Strategies for Housing Workers in Los Angeles. I assume that you can all see my screen right now. So we received a School of Architecture Research in Architecture grant last spring for this project. But because of the pandemic, we had to postpone our research and ended up receiving a one-year extension. So we plan to start this project in June 2021, but today we will be presenting an outline and methods for this research adventure initiative. Workforce housing as a term gained recognition in the United States around 1970s when high property values in ski towns in Colorado prevented the local workforce from buying or renting accommodation close to their workplace. As a concept, it highlights how the workforce in expensive real estate markets, such as in resort towns and large metropolitan areas, is now priced out of the very places where they provide essential services. One of the biggest challenges of affordable housing today is the lack of coordination between housing policies and design interventions. On the one hand, policymakers and analysts do not engage with housing on an architectural level, while on the other, design practitioners typically avoid engaging in policymaking by primarily producing architectural responses to existing policies. Even though workers live in an environment shaped by both policy and architecture, their views, experiences, and knowledge are seldomly integrated into policymaking and design. To address the most pressing challenges of urban workforce housing, our research project will develop design strategies and policy proposals that consider users' perspectives and experiences. We start by asking what is an appropriate definition of workforce and workforce housing from historical and contemporary perspectives. What constitutes the workforce is a contested term. The Urban Land Institute defines a workforce in terms of those people who earn between 50 to 120% of the area median income. This definition, which is one of the most cited definitions in existing literature, includes people who are gainfully employed, like teachers, police officers, and firefighters, but who are unable to afford to rent or buy properties close to their places of employment. By classifying the workforce in terms of income only, this definition excludes those workers who provide essential services in non-traditional jobs, such as people who are self-employed or work in multiple minimum wage jobs. This limitation becomes even more significant when we consider how the nature of employment has changed from centralized to more dispersed forms of employment over the last several decades because of economic liberalization policies. Therefore, we take a more comprehensive definition of workforce that includes opportunities for shelter to those who neither qualify for public subsidies or housing assistance programs, nor can afford to buy or rent on current market rates. In our project on workforce housing, we ask, what are the existing top-down policies and institutional structures to house the urban workforce in Los Angeles? What role, if any, do employers play in subsidizing housing costs for their workers in expensive real estate markets? Does the nature of work impact housing conditions and typologies in different types of urban workers? Finally, and most importantly, what bottom-up strategies are used by workers to house themselves in expensive housing markets? To answer these questions, we plan to examine the existing housing conditions of 3 communities of workers in Los Angeles who represent a range of employment options from public and in private sectors. The first category of workforce group comes from a private employer, Aramark. Aramark is an American Fortune 500 corporation that provides facilities, food, and uniform services to large institutions like universities, hospitals, and prisons. At USC, Aramark has been providing custodial services for over 20 years. The subcontracted Aramark staff at USC is represented by a union called Service Employees International Union. The Facilities Management Services, FMS, at USC manages all custodial services. So we plan to contact Aramark, SEIU, FMS to learn about company incentives and policies, if any, for employee housing, and to establish contact with Aramark workers in particular to learn about their current housing needs and arrangements. Oops, sorry about that. And then our second group of workforce comprises Los Angeles street vendors. In Los Angeles, as you may already know, thousands of street vendors and entrepreneurs provide economic food and merchandise to residents of the city. In 2008, LA Street Vendors Campaign was established as a women-led coalition of street vendors and their allies against the routine harassment and criminalization faced by street vendors. In 2018, LA Street Vendors Campaign was successful in decriminalizing street vending at both the state and city levels. Many street vendors are undocumented immigrants, so they are excluded from public housing programs. But as an organized group of entrepreneurs, we believe that they could provide us important insights on the housing conditions of self-employed workers. So in order to gain insights about the housing conditions of street vendors in LA and to establish contacts with street vendors for focused interview sessions, we plan to interview members of community organizations working with street vendors such as ELAC, East Los Angeles Community Corporation, Inclusive Action for the City, and the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights. And finally, the housing conditions of government employees forms the third type of workforce housing that we plan to study. Based on our interviews of firefighters and city workers and an analysis of existing housing incentives available for government employees, we will be able to develop a comparison between existing policies and housing conditions of the workforce in both the public and private sectors in LA. So Sasha will now take over from here to discuss our research methods.
Yes, hello everyone. I might have to turn off my video if it gets too patchy. My internet is not very well at the moment. I will talk about the research methods and the research framework a little bit. So deriving from the research and architecture program's objectives to investigate workforce housing, our pilot study specifically attempts to combine knowledge from stakeholders that usually work in separate domains. Aiming at integrating different perspectives, our pilot study therefore established a transdisciplinary methodological setup. To be sure, here we understand the distinction between inter and transdisciplinary as follows. Interdisciplinarity obviously means to collaborate across established disciplines. Transdisciplinary, on the other hand, is supposed to work across sectors, meaning the inclusion of academics, administrative workers, practitioners, and very importantly, citizens and lay people. Based on this trajectory, our project will be framed by what we broadly define as historical policy and action research. With the historical and theoretical study, we will clarify and define the term workforce housing, as Faisal already mentioned, introduced a little bit. And we will identify and classify best practices for workforce housing in different regional, political, and cultural settings. For the policy and case study analysis, we are going to collect and explore current federal, state, and municipal policies for workforce housing provision in LA. Furthermore, we will analyze two to three case studies that have been particularly developed for housing and workforce community in LA. Here we will apply methods of desk reviews, expert interviews, and spatial analysis. And finally, for what we define as action and design research, we will identify current housing needs and strategies for the three selected workforce groups. And we are going to attempt to develop and design proposals for potential improvement in the realm of policy, organization, and architecture through community engagement. Can you do the next slide, please? Here, the methods will comprise semi-structured interviews, participatory design assessments, design thinking workshops, and roundtable discussions. Furthermore, using these three components, our methodological framework is built on a specific sequence that is supposed to enable us to first gain original insights, then reflect on existing knowledge, and finally to develop new ideas to address current and future challenges of workforce housing. First, in order to gain these original insights, we flip the sequence of the above stated questions that Faisal mentioned and literally start from the bottom up. In order to avoid a policy and knowledge bias, the first step is meant to generate impartial insights by interviewing the respective workforce groups about their living conditions, challenges, as well as delights. Likewise, to avoid the sort of architectural and spatial bias, our research attempts to engage the workforce groups in a basic assessment of their existing spatial environment on the one hand, and in a projective exploration of what kind of spatial improvement they could see for themselves on the other hand. Second, after our fieldwork, we will examine in more depth the implicated historical and theoretical aspects, as well as perform the outlined policy and case study analysis. This will not only result in a clarification of existing policies and projects, but will also allow us to critically reflect on the insights and data we have gathered during our fieldwork. Critically assessing and comparing our gained knowledge from these first two phases, we will then identify successes, challenges, failures, gaps, and potential areas of improvement. Third and finally, in order to develop new ideas, our research cycle will end with another action design aspect, a collaborative design workshop, which plans to bring together the project's researchers, policy experts, and interviewed citizens to participate in a design challenge. Here, the attempt will be to translate the identified issues, failures, and potential improvements into project proposals through a design thinking process. This format will allow the development of ideas in an array of different categories, from organizational to policy, from process to physical design proposals. In conclusion, we understand our research project as an exploration to A, understand current complexities of workforce housing production, and B, to ideally develop more comprehensive and integrated approaches for workforce housing provision in the future. The proposed transdisciplinary setup offers great potential to bridge commonly established gaps by including knowledge from a variety of different stakeholders, particularly the affected communities. Although we are aware that participatory processes have gained a lot of momentum, particularly since the 1970s and in recent decades, participation is still mainly seen as a phase of consultation during a planning or research project. With our research setup, we would like to explore a format beyond this notion. What we call action and design research, in this case, is supposed to offer a framework that not only includes common methods of social sciences or urban anthropology, but opportunities to include the attitudes and knowledge of stakeholders in a projective, formative manner. In other words, our proposed study is understood as a test run for combining a transdisciplinary research setup with a design thinking method that not only allows to incorporate knowledge of directly affected stakeholders, but also attempts to include these actors to envision new ideas and innovative solutions. Our aspiration is that combining approaches of social sciences research and understanding our expertise and methods in design in a broader sense could produce a unique and maybe innovative setup that enables a more fluid and interrelated application of research, analysis, action, community engagement, and ultimately spatial formation. That was it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Faiza and Sasha. I really don't know when we're going to be sent back into the other room. So I'm going to continue this discussion, and if we are abruptly interrupted and you're just teleported back into the main room, that will be what it is. So we'll just go ahead. I'd like to thank everyone for the presentations, and this is a wonderful grouping of projects. Actually, the relationship between work, labor, housing, means of, and as well as questions of housing, typology and production are all throughout the various discussions. I want to make sure all of our speakers are available to comment. Is Tina, are you available as well? Didn't see your camera on.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
We're still here.
Well, what I'd like to invite anyone who has a very specific question to add that to the chat as part of the discussion, or if the presenters, if you have questions for each other based on that. So maybe Tina and Jan, I'm just really appreciated your project. I think that this was something that we saw back in back at the A+D museum, back when there was an A+D museum, and we went to such things in physical spaces, etc. Did you know, as you heard this, maybe the other presenters discuss their topics today, did you two have any thoughts about new opportunities for the implementation of the product and system that you're thinking to create?
Yeah, I do wonder kind of what the future of that kind of solution could be quite a bit. I'd like to think that we are going to need less of it, honestly. I think ideally what would be great is to see that the products aren't disposable, first of all. I mean, that's a big difference from what we're trying to do and what we see around being used, is that there's a kind of disposable nature to everything that's being applied to our housing crisis. With the way that the product was developed with solid surface material, the idea is that it would be storable, right? And the way that these things can collapse and actually be stored in a really compact way. And so if all of these units were only used for so like emergency relief, and that kind of usage, I think that would be the best, that we wouldn't have so much need for interim housing. But then again, we're always looking for ever denser solutions. So, who knows? These might be applied in other areas, but really, I think if it's going anywhere, it's probably going to be, we would hope, we just try to be optimistic about it, that it's going to be a more temporary solution and less of a permanent one.
Yeah, I also wonder, you know, with Ginger's presentation, thinking about the nature of the post-Fordism economy, what that means for housing homeless populations in centralized spaces, like in inner city spaces, in the way when urbanization becomes more open or widespread, or there's less centralized working, and how that changes. I mean, I do wonder about that as well, and what those possibilities might be. And then I think, well, I'm reading the chat here as well, and bringing up Ginger, seeing that Marcos has a question for Ginger. Why don't I just read the questions here, so we can just keep all of the questions in the same place? So if Ginger, if you wanted to respond to any of what we were just talking about, of course, or to Marcos's, and especially to Marcos's question, where he is wondering, what is the role of unionization in the forms of collective spatial power your manifesto imagines?
Yeah, I have 50 seconds, I just learned. So I'll just quickly address Marco's question, which is that I don't, the problem of giving a 10-minute presentation is I realized while presenting that it might be kind of misleading, and that I'm not trying to suggest that design, right, is a solution for problems that are clearly political and social in nature. And that I think, and that sort of the issue of data visualization is sort of the real thrust of the project, and that could be used as a tool, to sort of supplement efforts for organized labor and perhaps unionization. Because I think we're at a moment, despite recent setbacks, like in Alabama, where there could be a real push for unionization. I think there is always the problem, though, of undocumented laborers, right, who are left out of course,